I'd rather chew glass than sit through another dinner with that gold-digging Leech. Those were the exact words I heard drift out of my own son's mouth on the night of my granddaughter's engagement party, and for one full second, I forgot how to breathe. I was standing in the hallway outside the study, holding a glass of scotch I'd poured to steady my nerves, and I was listening to my own boy talk about the man his daughter was about to marry like he was something you scraped off a boot. Most grandfathers would have walked in and knocked the smugness clean off that young man's face. But you don't spend 41 years building a construction empire in Charlotte, North Carolina, by losing your temper the first time somebody hands you a reason to. You survive by smiling, by watching, and by making absolutely sure that when you finally strike, there's nothing left standing when the dust settles. So let me tell you how I ended up destroying the man who thought he could humiliate my granddaughter in front of 200 people and walk away clean. And before I go any further, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight, because I've got a feeling a lot of you are going to see somebody you know in this story. Let me back up. My name is Walter Holloway, and I'm 68 years old. I built Holloway Construction from a single pickup truck and a stack of unpaid invoices into one of the largest commercial contracting firms in the Carolinas. My wife, Eleanor, passed 6 years ago from a stroke that took her from me in the space of one Tuesday afternoon. And since then, the only thing that's kept the lights on in my chest has been my granddaughter, Bailey. Her mother, my daughter-in-law, left when Bailey was 4, and my son Grant raised her mostly on his own while running our field crews. I stepped in where I could. I taught that girl to ride a bike in the gravel lot behind our warehouse. I sat in the front row of every school recital, every science fair, every single graduation. When she got into veterinary school at NC State, I cried in the truck before I ever told her how proud I was, because I didn't want her to see an old man fall apart in a parking lot. Bailey is 26 now. She's gentle in a way this world doesn't reward nearly enough. The kind of person who used to bring home stray dogs before she ever brought home a boyfriend. So when she came to me 8 months ago glowing, telling me she'd met a man named Colton Vance at a charity gala for the county animal shelter, I wanted so badly to believe it was as simple as it sounded. Colton introduced himself as the founder of a sustainable real estate investment platform out of Raleigh, all tailored blazers and a handshake that lasted just a half-second too long, like he was trying to convince you of something instead of greeting you. He had answers for everything. He had a story for every question. In my line of work, you learn that men who have an answer ready before you finish the question are usually the men worth watching closest. I didn't say any of that to Bailey. I just watched. The engagement party was held in my own backyard because Bailey asked for it that way, and because I would have paved the moon for that girl if she asked me to. I spent $62,000 turning my property into something out of a magazine. String lights strung between the oaks, a jazz trio near the pond, a caterer flown in from Charleston, 200 guests, half the business contacts I'd built over 4 decades, half Bailey's friends from vet school, and Colton's people, who mostly seemed to be men in expensive shoes who laughed a beat too loud at his jokes. I'd gone inside to grab a bottle of the good bourbon from my study when I heard voices coming from behind the half-closed door. I stopped in the hallway. I don't know what made me stop instead of walking in. Maybe 40 years of reading rooms before you enter them. "Come on, man, she's not that bad," said a voice I recognized as Colton's best man, a slick-haired fellow named Preston who worked at the same firm. "I'd rather chew glass than touch that gold-digging Leech," Colton said, and I heard the ice clink in his glass like it was the most casual thing in the world. "She's needy. She cries about dead animals like it's her whole personality. But her grandfather's worth what? 40, 50 million? Once that rings on her finger and the old man kicks the bucket, I'm set for life. I just have to smile through a few more Sunday dinners and pretend I care about her stupid rescue shelter." Preston laughed. "Man, you are cold." "I'm efficient," Colton said. "There's a difference." I stood in that hallway with my hand flat against the wall, and I felt something in my chest go still and cold, the way a lake freezes over from the edges inward. I did not storm through that door. I did not throw my drink in his face, though God knows every muscle in my body wanted to. I thought of Eleanor, and what she used to tell me back when I was a younger man ready to fight every contractor who tried to cheat us on a bid. She'd put her hand on my arm and say, "Walter, the loudest man in the room is rarely the most dangerous one." So I closed my eyes, and I let the anger settle into something usable, something patient. I walked back to that party, and I found my son Grant near the bar, and I told him, quietly, that we needed to talk in the morning. Then I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I walked up to Colton Vance, shook his hand, and told him how happy I was to be welcoming him into this family. I watched him smile back at me with that same practiced, hollow charm, completely unaware that he had just signed his own death warrant, figuratively speaking, in my study not 10 minutes earlier. That night, lying awake at 2 in the morning, I made myself a promise. I was not going to yell. I was not going to threaten. I was going to take this young man apart so completely, so thoroughly, that by the time I was finished, he would understand exactly what it costs to call my granddaughter a leech in a house I built with my own 2 hands. The next morning, I called Derek Monroe. Derek had done private investigation work for Holloway Construction for almost 15 years, mostly background checks on subcontractors and the occasional insurance fraud case. I sat him down in my office, and I told him everything I'd heard. Find out who this man really is, I told him. Not the story he tells at dinner parties, the real one. It took Derek 11 days. What he brought back to me was worse than anything I'd imagined. Colton Vance's sustainable real estate platform was, in reality, a shell company 2 payments away from insolvency. He'd taken out predatory loans from a private lending group in Charlotte and a separate group out of Atlanta, using falsified property appraisals as collateral. He had, in the past 3 years, been quietly engaged to 2 other women, both from wealthy families. Both engagements dissolved within months, under circumstances that, according to Derek's sources, were never fully explained. And there was a woman named Simone in Raleigh, a hostess at a rooftop bar, who Colton had been seeing regularly for the past 5 months, including twice during the same week as my granddaughter's engagement party. I sat with that folder open on my desk for a long time. I did not feel rage anymore. Rage is loud, and it burns fast, and it leaves you with nothing but ash and regret. What I felt was colder than that. What I felt was clarity. I am not a violent man. I have never once, in 68 years, raised a hand against another human being, and I was not about to start with this one. But I have spent 4 decades learning exactly how debt works, how leverage works, how a man's entire life can be restructured on paper by someone who understands the numbers better than he does. Colton thought he was hunting an old fool with a soft heart and a fat bank account. He had no idea he had just wandered directly into the one arena where I have never lost. I want you to find out exactly who holds his loans, I told Derek. Every single one. I want names, amounts, maturity dates, and I want to know who's representing that lending group out of Atlanta. Derek looked at me for a long moment. You're not just going to call off the wedding, are you, Walter? No, I said. I'm going to buy him. Over the following weeks, I did precisely that. Through a holding company that had no visible connection to my name or to Holloway Construction, I quietly purchased Colton's outstanding debt from both lending groups at a steep discount, because struggling lenders are always eager to offload risk onto someone patient enough to wait for it to mature. I became, without his knowledge, the sole creditor standing behind every loan, keeping his fraudulent little company from collapsing. I did not call in the debt. Not yet. A predator who feels the trap closing will bolt. I needed him relaxed. I needed him comfortable. I needed him standing at that altar believing the money was already his. At the same time, I played my part beautifully. I invited Colton to lunch at the country club. I asked him about his business with the wide-eyed interest of a doting old man hoping to be impressed by his granddaughter's fiancé. I told him, over steak and bourbon, that I'd always admired the hustle of young entrepreneurs, that Bailey's happiness meant more to me than anything else on this earth, and that if there was ever anything I could do to support his company, he need only ask. His eyes lit up like a slot machine paying out. Actually, Mr. Holloway, he said, leaning forward, there is something. We're preparing for a major expansion round, and having a strategic investor with your reputation behind us would open a lot of doors. I smiled and told him I'd have my attorney, a sharp, unshakable woman named Renata Cole, draft up the paperwork. Renata built that agreement like a bear trap disguised as a birthday present. Buried in the fine print, beneath language so dense most men wouldn't read past the second paragraph, was a clause tying his personal assets, his condominium, his leased Porsche, his remaining company shares, directly to the loan as collateral, activated automatically upon any default or any material misrepresentation discovered regarding the company's financial health. Colton skimmed it. He asked a few surface-level questions about repayment timelines. He signed it 2 days later in my office, practically giddy, without ever once asking why an 80-year-old construction magnate was so eager to hand a stranger $3 million. Bailey, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening. That was the hardest part. Harder than the anger. Harder than watching Colton kiss her hand at family dinners with that same practiced tenderness he probably used on Simone, the rooftop hostess. I had to watch my granddaughter fall deeper in love with a lie, knowing every single day that the ground beneath that lie was already mine. The wedding was scheduled for the third Saturday in October at a vineyard estate 40 minutes outside Charlotte. The kind of place with 220 guests and a string quartet and a cake that cost more than my first house. 2 nights before the ceremony, at the rehearsal dinner, everything I had built for 4 months was going to come due, whether Colton Vance knew it yet or not. The morning of the rehearsal dinner, Derek called me with one final piece of information, the one I'd been waiting on. Colton had, 3 days earlier, wired $40,000 to an account in Simone's name, using funds from the very expansion round I had financed, not just cheating on my granddaughter, stealing my money to fund the affair he was having behind her back. I sat in my truck outside the vineyard for 10 minutes before I could make myself walk inside, because for the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt something close to my old temper trying to claw its way back up my throat. I let it pass. I thought of Eleanor. I thought of Bailey learning to ride that bicycle in the gravel lot, laughing so hard she nearly fell twice before she finally found her balance. I thought about what it costs a man to protect the people he loves, and I decided, once and for all, that Colton Vance was going to pay every last cent of that cost. The rehearsal dinner was held in the vineyard's grand tasting hall. Exposed wooden beams, string lights, 220 of the Carolina's finest, all dressed in their rehearsal-appropriate best, though half of them had clearly interpreted that as full black tie. Bailey looked radiant in a soft blue dress, laughing at something Colton's mother had said, completely unaware that her grandfather was carrying a leather folder heavy enough to end the evening. Around 8:30, after the appetizers had cleared and the wine had loosened the room, Colton stood at the head table and tapped his fork against his glass. The room quieted. Every face turned toward him, that same practiced, camera-ready smile spreading across his handsome face. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall's speakers. "In just 2 days, I get to marry the most incredible woman I have ever known. Bailey Holloway has taught me what it means to build something real." I let him get through nearly the entire speech. I let him say the word real 4 separate times, which, given what I knew, struck me as almost admirable in its audacity. Then, when he raised his glass for the toast, I stood up from my seat at the family table. "Colton," I said, my voice steady, carrying just as easily through that same sound system. "Before we toast, I think there's something the room deserves to know about the man Bailey's about to marry." The room went dead silent. Bailey turned toward me, confusion flickering across her face, and for a moment I nearly lost my nerve looking at her. But I thought of that voice behind the study door, gold-digging Leech, and I opened the folder. I explained, calmly, without a single raised syllable, that I had spent the past several weeks discovering the truth about Colton Vance's business, his falsified appraisals, his predatory loans, his 2 previous broken engagements. I explained that I had, through legal and entirely documented means, become the sole creditor on every debt currently keeping his company alive, and that as of that morning, due to material misrepresentation clearly outlined in our signed agreement, every asset he owned, tied to that collateral clause his own attorney should have flagged, now legally belonged to my holding company. And then, because I believed Bailey deserved to hear every piece of it before she made a decision that would cost her the rest of her life, I told the room about the $40,000 wired to a woman named Simone 3 days before his wedding, using my money. For a long, frozen moment, Colton simply stood there, his mouth slightly open, his glass trembling in his hand. Then something in him snapped. "You think you're clever, old man?" he shouted, his voice cracking through the speakers, distorted and ugly. "You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone and just walk away? You have no idea what I could have done for this family. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Several guests gasped. Colton's own mother put a hand over her mouth. I did not move. I did not raise my voice to match his. I simply stood there, holding that folder, and let 220 witnesses watch a man's true face finally show itself in the light. "That's exactly the man I was hoping this room would see," I said quietly. "Because now nobody has to take my word for it." Two sheriff's deputies, whom Renata had quietly arranged to be present, given the scale of the fraud involved, stepped forward from the back of the hall. Colton's face drained of color as they approached. He lunged for the microphone stand as if it could somehow save him, knocking over a candle, sending a ripple of gasps through the crowd, before Preston, his own best man, stepped back and refused to touch him, as though the fraud itself might be contagious. Bailey stood frozen beside her seat, tears streaming silently down her face, watching the man she believed she loved get led out of the tasting hall in handcuffs, while 200 guests sat in stunned, breathless silence. I walked to her before the doors had even finished closing behind him. I didn't say a word at first. I just opened my arms, and she collapsed into them the way she used to when she was small and had scraped her knee on the gravel behind the warehouse. "I've got you, sweetheart," I whispered into her hair. "You're safe. Grandpa's got you." She cried harder than I have ever heard another human being cry, and I held her, and I let her, because some things need to be grieved before they can be healed. In the weeks that followed, Colton Vance was formally charged with securities fraud and wire fraud, given the falsified appraisals and the interstate nature of his lending schemes. His trial was brief, since the paper trail Derek and Renata had assembled left his attorney almost nothing to work with. He was sentenced to 7 years, though I understand these things are rarely served in full. His business partners, once they learned the full extent of what he'd done, severed every remaining connection within days. Simone, as it turned out, had no idea he was engaged, and when she found out, she was the one who provided investigators with the final piece of documented evidence they needed. Bailey struggled for a long time after. There were nights she called me at 11 o'clock just to hear my voice, and I never once let it ring twice. Grief and betrayal move slowly through a person, and I let her move through it at her own pace, the way I let her learn to ride that bicycle all those years ago. Patient, steady, never rushing her toward a finish line she wasn't ready for. It took the better part of a year, but Bailey eventually returned to the animal shelter where she and Colton had first met, this time as a volunteer veterinarian rather than a guest at a gala. She tells me now that some of her favorite days are the ones where she gets to hold a frightened, abandoned dog and watch it slowly learn that not every hand raised toward it is going to hurt it. I think about that a great deal. I think there is something in it about all of us. As for the assets that legally transferred to my holding company that morning at the vineyard, I liquidated every last piece of it and donated the entirety, just over $1.1 million, once all debts were settled, to the same county animal shelter where Bailey now works 3 days a week. I did not do it for recognition. I did it because it felt like the only way to take something so rotten and turn it into something that might do a little good in this world. People sometimes ask me if I regret how far I went. The debt, the shell company, the 4 months of smiling at a man I wanted nothing more than to see disappear from my family's life. I tell them the truth every time. I would do every single piece of it again, and I would not lose 1 hour of sleep over any of it. Because true wealth was never about the number sitting in my bank account. It is about what a man is willing to sacrifice, in patience, in restraint, in 4 long months of biting his tongue, to protect the people he loves most in this world. Predators like Colton Vance will always exist. They wear tailored blazers and practice smiles, and they are always searching for a soft heart to exploit. My advice to every single one of you watching tonight, especially the parents and grandparents among you, is this: never let your desire for a peaceful family blind you to the truth standing right in front of you. Trust what you hear when someone believes nobody is listening, because that is always who they really are. Money can build houses and companies and legacies, but its truest power is in its ability to completely dismantle the men who believe they can hide in its shadow. I stood in that tasting hall long after the guests had gone home that night, and I watched the deputies' taillights disappear down the vineyard's long gravel drive, and I thought about Eleanor, and how proud she would have been of the girl our son had raised, and of the grandfather I had finally become. And I knew, without a single doubt in my heart, that protecting Bailey that night was, without question, the single greatest investment I have ever made in my entire life.